When Hannah Harrington attended her grandfather's will reading, she expected nothing. While her cousins inherited millions in pristine real estate, the lawyer slid a velvet pouch across the mahogany table toward her. Inside wasn't a deed or a check. It was a heavy, rusted iron key. And a warning. The conference room at Cromwell, Finch and Abernathy on the 42nd floor of the Chicago financial district smelled of expensive leather lemon polish and old money. Hannah Harrington sat at the far end of the sprawling mahogany table, acutely aware of the scuff marks on her boots and the frayed cuffs of her thrifted blazer. She didn't belong here. She never had. Her grandfather, Arthur Harrington, had been a titan of Midwestern industry, a man whose shipping empire had amassed a fortune that most people could scarcely comprehend. But Hannah's mother, Arthur's youngest daughter, had been disowned decades ago for marrying a public school teacher instead of the banking heir Arthur had chosen. When Hannah's parents died in a car accident, leaving her orphaned at 14, Arthur had paid for her basic foster care and education, but he had never offered her a place in his home or his heart. Now, at 26, drowning in student loans and working double shifts at a downtown diner, Hannah was only here because she had received a formal, legally binding summons. At the head of the table sat William Abernathy, a lawyer whose bespoke suit cost more than Hannah's annual rent. To her left sat her Aunt Cassandra Harrington Smith, dripping in pearls and barely concealed disdain. Next to Cassandra was her son, Cousin Leo, who was currently checking his Rolex every 3 minutes, as if this multi-million-dollar inheritance process was a tragic waste of his afternoon. Moving on to the primary assets, Abernathy droned, adjusting his spectacles. To Cassandra Harrington Smith, I leave the Highland Park estate, the portfolio of municipal bonds managed by Vanguard, and a 51% controlling stake in Harrington Logistics. Cassandra offered a tight, satisfied smile. She didn't even look at Hannah. To my grandson, Leo Harrington Smith, I leave the vintage automotive collection housed in the Geneva facility, alongside the liquid assets held in the Cayman Trust to be disbursed at his 30th birthday. Leo let out a breath, leaning back in his chair. Finally. Abernathy cleared his throat, his eyes flicking toward Hannah for a fraction of a second before returning to the thick parchment. And finally to my granddaughter, Hannah Harrington. The room went entirely still. Cassandra stiffened her posture, rigid with sudden apprehension. Leo stopped looking at his watch. To Hannah, Abernathy read his voice, losing some of its previous grandiosity. I leave the contents of the black velvet pouch, currently in the possession of my executor. I also leave her my final words. True wealth is never handed to you. It is unearthed. If you are half the woman your mother was, you will know what to do. Abernathy reached into his leather briefcase and pulled out a small faded black velvet pouch. He didn't hand it to her. He simply pushed it across the polished mahogany. It slid to a halt inches from Hannah's hands. Cassandra let out a harsh, glittering laugh. A pouch? What is it, Arthur's old golf tees? Hannah ignored her. With trembling fingers she loosened the drawstrings. She tipped the pouch over her palm. A heavy object dropped into her hand with a dull clink. It wasn't a diamond ring. It wasn't a gold coin. It was a key. It was large, perhaps 4 inches long, forged from heavy iron and completely coated in a thick reddish-brown layer of rust. It looked like it belonged to a medieval dungeon, not a modern inheritance. There was no accompanying letter. No bank name. Nothing. Is this a joke? Hannah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Her chest tightened with a familiar, suffocating humiliation. Even in death, Arthur Harrington had found a way to remind her that she was worth nothing to him. That is the entirety of your bequest, Miss Harrington, Abernathy said, smoothly closing his folder. "The firm has executed the will to the letter." "A rusty key," Leo snorted, standing up and buttoning his suit jacket. "Don't spend it all in one place, Hannah." "Come on, Mother. We have a meeting with the brokers." Hannah sat frozen as her wealthy relatives swept out of the room, leaving behind a trail of expensive perfume and the echo of their disregard. Abernathy gave her a polite, entirely devoid of warmth nod before exiting through a side door. Hannah was alone. She looked down at the key. The rust stained her pale skin. She wanted to throw it out the window, to hurl it into the Chicago River and wash her hands of the Harrington family forever. But as her thumb brushed over the bow of the key, the rounded top, she felt a strange indentation beneath the flakes of corrosion. Pulling a napkin from her pocket, Hannah aggressively rubbed the top of the key. As the rust flaked away, tiny stamped letters emerged into the harsh fluorescent light of the boardroom. WBT Vault B 744. Hannah frowned. It wasn't an antique novelty. It was a functioning registered lockbox key. That night, in her cramped Logan Square apartment, Hannah sat at her kitchen table, illuminated by a single flickering bulb. She had a massive pile of overdue bills on her left and the rusted key on her right. She opened her laptop and began searching. WBT Chicago. Page after page of irrelevant results flooded her screen. A broadcasting company, a water treatment plant. She refined the search. WBT Bank Vault Chicago. A hit. A digitized newspaper clipping from the Chicago Tribune, dated November 14th, 1978. Westcott Bank and Trust faces insolvency. Westcott Bank and Trust, WBT. Hannah read the article. Westcott had been a private, highly exclusive bank catering to Chicago's elite industrialists during the mid-20th century. It had gone under in the late 70s amid whispers of corruption and mismanagement. The assets had been quietly bought up by a massive corporate conglomerate, and the physical bank itself, a brutalist concrete fortress on the edge of the industrial district, had been shuttered. Hannah found the address, 412 South Halsted Street. The next morning, Hannah called in sick to her diner shift. She couldn't explain why, but her grandfather's final words kept ringing in her ears. "If you are half the woman your mother was, you will know what to do." Arthur hadn't given her money, but he had given her a thread, and Hannah was desperate enough to pull it. The rain in Chicago that Tuesday was relentless, turning the city into a canvas of grey slush. Hannah stood across the street from 412 South Halsted. The old Westcott Bank and Trust building was a decaying monolith. It was surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with rusted razor wire. The windows were either boarded up with rotting plywood or shattered, resembling jagged missing teeth. Faded "Condemned" and "No trespassing" signs were plastered across the concrete. It looked less like a financial institution and more like a mausoleum. Hannah pulled the collar of her thrifted trench coat tight against the wind. "This is insane," she thought. "The building has been abandoned for 40 years. If there was anything of value, looters or the city would have stripped it bare decades ago. But the heavy iron key sitting in her coat pocket felt like a lodestone pulling her forward. She walked the perimeter until she found a section of the chain-link fence in the back alley that had been compromised, pulled back just enough by local trespassers to allow a person to slip through. Hannah squeezed her way and, tearing a small hole in her coat, and stepped into the overgrown weeds of the loading dock. The back security door was chained shut, but a rusted-out ventilation grate near the ground had caved in. With a grimace, Hannah dropped to her hands and knees and crawled into the darkness. She landed on a concrete floor with a soft thud. The air inside was freezing and thick with the smell of mildew, asbestos, and decades of undisturbed dust. She clicked on her heavy-duty flashlight. The beam cut through the gloom, illuminating a massive, ruined lobby. The marble teller counters had been smashed. Graffiti covered the walls. Nature was reclaiming the space, with vines creeping through cracks in the ceiling. Vault B. Hannah whispered, her voice echoing unnervingly in the vast, empty space. Standard safe deposit boxes were usually kept in the basement. Hannah navigated through the debris, finding a stairwell marked with a faded sign, "Lower level, secure depositories." She descended the stairs carefully, her flashlight beam bouncing off the peeling paint. The basement was entirely windowless. It was an absolute suffocating blackness. At the bottom of the stairs, the corridor split. To the right, Vault A, general access. To the left, behind a heavy iron gate that had miraculously avoided the looters' crowbars, Vault B, private client reserve. Hannah approached the gate. It was locked with a heavy padlock, but the hinges holding the gate to the concrete wall had completely rusted through. Hannah kicked the bottom hinge with the heel of her boot. Once, twice, 3 times. With a screech of tearing metal, the gate gave way, just enough for her to wedge herself through. She stood before Vault B. It wasn't a room of small lock boxes. It was a massive, circular steel door. A masterpiece of mid-century security engineering, standing 10 feet tall. But looking closer, Hannah saw a smaller secondary access door built into the wall beside it, a manual override or private access hatch for specific high-tier clients. Above this smaller door was a brass plaque, green with oxidation, Box 744. Hannah's breath caught in her throat. She pulled the rusty key from her pocket. Her hands were shaking so badly she dropped her flashlight. It clattered against the floor, rolling to cast a weird slanted light across the steel door. Hannah picked it up, took a deep breath, and inserted the iron key into the heavy mechanical lock of Box 744. It slid in perfectly. She gripped the rusted bow of the key and turned. At first, nothing happened. The internal tumblers were seized with 40 years of disuse. Hannah gritted her teeth, wrapping her entire hand around the key and forcing it with all her strength. Click, clack. A sound like a gunshot echoed through the basement as the heavy deadbolt disengaged. Hannah pulled the heavy handle, and the door swung open with a dreadful groaning creak. She shined her flashlight inside, expecting stacks of mouldering cash, perhaps gold bars or maybe an empty looted space. Instead, she found a sterile, dry compartment containing 3 items. 1. A stack of manila folders, thick and bound with twine. 2. A small black leather-bound ledger. 3. A tarnished silver pocket watch. Hannah reached in and pulled out the pocket watch first. It was her grandfather's. She recognized the intricate engraving of a ship on the casing. Why would he hide this here? She set it down and picked up the ledger. The leather was dry and cracking. She opened it to the first page. It was entirely filled with Arthur Harrington's sharp, meticulous handwriting. Date October 14th, 1978. The liquidation of Westcott Bank was successful. Abernathy handled the quiet transfer of the municipal pensions. They suspect nothing. The Harrington Trust has absorbed the remaining $42 million in undocumented capital. Cassandra is named primary beneficiary to shield the assets from federal audit. Hannah stopped breathing. She read it again. And then she flipped the page. Page after page detailed a massive systemic financial crime. Her grandfather hadn't just built an empire, he had stolen the foundation of it. He had essentially looted a failing bank, ruined hundreds of municipal pensioners, and used his high-powered lawyer, William Abernathy, to launder the stolen money directly into the Harrington family trust, the exact trust that Cassandra and Leo had just inherited. The manila folders were worse. They contained the original undoctored deeds, the blackmail materials Arthur had used to silence the bank managers, and the paper trail proving that Cassandra's precious Highland Park estate was bought entirely with stolen pension funds. This wasn't an inheritance. It was a loaded gun. Arthur hadn't left Hannah a fortune. He had left her the power to destroy the entire Harrington legacy. He had known that Cassandra and Leo were greedy and vain, and he had left the nuclear codes to the one person they had treated like garbage her entire life. True wealth is never handed to you. It is unearthed. Hannah stared at the documents, her mind racing with the implications. She held enough evidence to send her Aunt Cassandra to federal prison and strip her cousins of every dime they owned. Suddenly the hair on the back of Hannah's neck stood up. She heard a sound. It wasn't the settling of an old building. It was the distinct rhythmic crunch of heavy boots stepping on broken glass. Someone was walking across the lobby upstairs. Hannah immediately clicked off her flashlight, plunging the vault room into absolute darkness. She held her breath, pressing herself flat against the cold steel of the vault door. The footsteps reached the top of the basement stairs. They paused. Then a beam of blinding white LED light pierced the darkness of the stairwell, sweeping across the rusted walls. "I know you're down here, Hannah." A deep male voice echoed down the concrete corridor. It was a voice she had never heard before, rough and utterly calm. "Abernathy warned me you were smart, but coming down here alone, that was a mistake." The footsteps began descending the stairs. Hannah clutched the black ledger to her chest, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She was trapped in the basement, hundreds of feet from the exit, holding the most dangerous secret in Chicago. And whoever was coming down those stairs wasn't carrying a briefcase. They were carrying a gun. The flashlight beam swept over the rusted safety deposit boxes, casting long, distorted shadows against the peeling concrete walls, before finally pinning Hannah in its blinding halo. Hannah squinted, raising a hand to shield her eyes. The man standing at the threshold of Vault B was tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in a charcoal trench coat that looked completely out of place in the decaying basement. In his right hand, resting casually by his side, but undeniably present, was a suppressed Heckler & Koch USP tactical pistol. "Step away from the box, Hannah," the man said. His tone wasn't frantic. It was the bored, level voice of a professional who had done this 100 times before. "Who are you?" Hannah demanded, her voice shaking only slightly. She backed up against the cold steel of the vault door, clutching the dry, cracked leather of her grandfather's ledger tight to her chest. "My name is Garrett Cole," the man replied, lowering the flashlight just enough so it wasn't blinding her, allowing her to see his impassive, weathered face. "I'm a private contractor. I work for William Abernathy. Now I'm going to ask you nicely to hand over the ledger and the folders. You don't want to die in a condemned basement over money that isn't even yours." Hannah's mind raced. Abernathy. The lawyer. He knew. She breathed the pieces rapidly snapping together. Abernathy knew Arthur hid the evidence of the Westcott Bank embezzlement. Of course he knew, Garrett scoffed, taking a slow step into the vault. Abernathy was the architect of the whole damn thing. He laundered the stolen municipal pensions through offshore shell companies before funneling them into the Harrington family trust. But your grandfather, paranoid old bastard that he was, didn't trust anyone. He kept the original documents. Insurance just in case Abernathy ever tried to turn on him. When Arthur died, Abernathy panicked. He didn't know where the insurance policy was hidden. Until the will reading, Hannah realized a cold knot forming in her stomach. The rusty key. Exactly, Garrett said, taking another step. Abernathy couldn't refuse to hand over the key. It was legally bound in the will, and there were too many witnesses. But he knew you'd go looking for the lock it belonged to. He just had to pay me to follow you. Let you do the dirty work of finding it, and then clean up the mess. So last chance, Hannah. Toss the book. Hannah looked down at the ledger. It was the only thing keeping her alive. If she handed it over, Garrett would shoot her and leave her body in a vault that no one had entered in 40 years. If Abernathy destroys this, Hannah said, her voice finding a sudden, desperate strength, he's safe. But Cassandra and Leo keep the money they stole from thousands of working-class people. That's capitalism, sweetheart. Hand it over. Garrett raised the pistol, aiming it squarely at her chest. Wait! Hannah yelled. How much is Abernathy paying you for this? 100,000? 200? Garrett's jaw tightened, but he didn't pull the trigger. That's none of your business. It is my business because you're holding a gun on me for a fraction of what this book is worth. Hannah's mind was operating on pure adrenaline now. She was channeling the ruthless business acumen that ran in her bloodline, the very same cold calculation her grandfather had used. Abernathy is playing you, Garrett. He's going to use you to destroy the evidence. And then you're a loose end. You think a high society lawyer who embezzled $42 million is going to let a mercenary walk around knowing his secret? Garrett paused. The pistol wavered a fraction of an inch. Look at this, Hannah said, tapping the cover of the ledger. This is a nuclear bomb. If I take this to the FBI or the Securities and Exchange Commission, Abernathy goes to federal prison for the rest of his life. Cassandra and Leo lose everything. The government will seize the Highland Park estate, the Geneva car collection, the Vanguard portfolios. Every single dime. So you want to be a hero? Garrett asked, his eyes narrowing. That doesn't get me paid. I don't want to be a hero. Hannah lied, her heart pounding. I want what's mine. My grandfather left me with a rusty key and a lifetime of humiliation. Cassandra and Leo treated me like dirt. I want the Harrington Empire, all of it. Garrett let out a low whistle, ambitious for a diner waitress. I need a partner, Hannah said, locking eyes with the hitman. I can't walk into Abernathy's office alone with these documents. He'll have security throw me out or worse. But if you walk in with me, if we use this to force them to sign over the assets to me, she took a deep breath, playing her final card. I will pay you $5 million. Untraceable. Straight from the Cayman accounts once I have control. That's 50 times whatever Abernathy is paying you to pull that trigger. The silence in the vault was deafening, broken only by the distant, muffled sound of the Chicago rain hitting the pavement outside. Garrett stared at her, his calculating eyes assessing the girl in the torn, thrifted trench coat who was suddenly talking like a Wall Street raider. Slowly, Garrett lowered the gun. He engaged the safety with a sharp click and slid the weapon into his shoulder holster. $5 million, Garrett said, his voice deadly serious. And if you try to screw me, Hannah, I won't just kill you. I'll make it last. $5 million? Hannah agreed, exhaling a breath she felt like she had been holding for an eternity. She carefully placed the ledger and the folders into a canvas tote bag she had brought. Now let's go pay my family a visit. 48 hours later, the atmosphere in the executive boardroom of Cromwell Finch and Abernathy was radically different. Cassandra Harrington Smith sat at the mahogany table, furiously tapping a diamond-encrusted pen against her leather portfolio. Leo was pacing by the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago skyline, glaring at his phone. William Abernathy sat at the head of the table, his usual smug demeanor replaced by a sheen of nervous sweat on his forehead. "William, what is the meaning of this?" Cassandra snapped. "We signed the final probate documents yesterday. The estate is settled. Why were we summoned back here under threat of legal injunction?" "I assure you, Cassandra, I am just as confused as you are." Abernathy lied, dabbing his forehead with a silk handkerchief. He had been trying to reach Garrett Cole for 2 days. The fixer had gone completely dark, and a sickening feeling of dread was crawling up the lawyer's spine. The heavy mahogany doors swung open. Hannah Harrington walked in. She was no longer wearing scuffed boots and a frayed blazer. She wore a tailored charcoal grey Tom Ford suit that cut a sharp, authoritative silhouette. Her hair was pulled back into a sleek, unforgiving knot. Trailing a few steps behind her, looking entirely relaxed, was Garrett Cole. Abernathy went deathly pale. The silk handkerchief slipped from his fingers and landed on the polished wood. "Hannah," Cassandra said, her voice dripping with venom. "What are you doing here? Security is supposed to keep vagrants out of the lobby." "Sit down, Cassandra," Hannah said, her voice echoing off the wood-panelled walls. It wasn't a request. Leo stopped pacing and scoffed. "Excuse me, who do you think—" Garrett smoothly stepped forward, pulling back the lapel of his coat, just enough to reveal the grip of his pistol. Leo swallowed his words and slowly backed into his chair. Hannah walked to the head of the table, standing directly opposite Abernathy. She unzipped a sleek leather briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of papers. She tossed them onto the center of the table. They were pristine photocopies. "What is this?" Cassandra asked, leaning forward, her eyes narrowing at the financial columns. "That," Hannah said coldly, "is a detailed, itemized record of how your father, Arthur Harrington, engineered the collapse of Westcott Bank and Trust in 1978. It details exactly how he stole $42 million from the pension funds of municipal workers, teachers, firefighters, sanitation workers, and laundered it into the Harrington Trust." Cassandra stared at the papers, her mouth opening and closing silently. "It also details," Hannah continued, turning her icy gaze to the lawyer, "how William Abernathy facilitated the entire fraud, utilizing offshore accounts in Panama and the Caymans to avoid federal scrutiny. It's all there in my grandfather's handwriting, along with the original undoctored deeds." "This is a forgery," Abernathy stammered, though his voice lacked any conviction. He looked at Garrett, his eyes pleading. "Garrett, what are you doing? I paid you to—" "You didn't pay me enough?" "William," Garrett interrupted, mildly, leaning against the doorframe. Hannah placed her hands on the table, leaning toward her aunt. "It's not a forgery. I have the original ledger and the original files safely locked in a private vault at Northern Trust. Furthermore, I have already drafted a timed email containing high-resolution scans of every single page. If I don't enter a passcode into my phone every 12 hours, that email is automatically sent to the director of the FBI, the SEC Enforcement Division, and the investigative desk at the Chicago Tribune." The room was paralyzed. The reality of the situation crashed over the Harrington heirs like a tidal wave. "If those files go public," Hannah said quietly, relishing the absolute terror in her aunt's eyes, "the government will freeze all your assets by tomorrow morning. Cassandra, you will lose the Highland Park estate. You will be indicted under the RICO Act for benefiting from a continuous criminal enterprise. Leo, your vintage cars will be auctioned off by the feds, and your trust will be drained to pay restitution. And William, you will be disbarred and die in a federal penitentiary." "What do you want?" Leo whispered, his voice cracking. He looked like a frightened child. "You want money? We can write you a check. 10 million. 20. "I don't want a check," Hannah said. She reached into her briefcase and pulled out a freshly drafted legal contract, sliding it across the table toward Abernathy. "I want everything." Abernathy picked up the contract with trembling hands. As he read it, his eyes widened in horror. This is a total divestment." "Explain it to them, William," Hannah commanded. Abernathy swallowed hard. "She wants you to sign over 80% of your inherited assets, including the controlling stake in Harrington Logistics and the entire Cayman Liquid Trust, to a newly formed corporate entity. the Hannah Harrington Foundation. 80%! Cassandra shrieked, slamming her hands on the table. You're insane. That leaves us with practically nothing. It leaves you with enough to live quietly. Hannah corrected her voice, dangerously calm, which is infinitely more than the pensioners your father robbed had to live on. You can keep the Highland Park house, but you will remortgage it. You will live comfortably, but you will never wield power in this city again. Hannah leaned in close to her aunt. You have 60 seconds to sign those papers, Cassandra, or I walk out that door and I let the feds burn the Harrington legacy to the ground. Cassandra looked at Leo, who was furiously nodding, tears welling in his eyes. She looked at Abernathy, who simply slumped in his chair, a broken man. She had no moves left. With a shaking hand, Cassandra picked up the diamond-encrusted pen. She signed her name on the dotted line. Leo practically scrambled to sign next. Hannah took the documents, inspecting the signatures carefully, before sliding them back into her briefcase. She looked at Abernathy. You will file these transfers immediately, William. Then you will announce your early retirement. If I ever see your name on a legal brief again, I release the Westcott files. Abernathy gave a slow, defeated nod. Hannah turned and walked toward the heavy mahogany doors. The scuffed boots and thrifted clothes were gone. In their place was a woman forged in the fires of betrayal, carrying the weight of a reclaimed empire. She paused at the door, looking back at her ruined relatives one last time. Grandfather was right, Hannah said, her voice echoing in the silent room. True wealth is never handed to you. You have to unearth it, and you have to be willing to bury anyone who gets in your way. She stepped out into the hallway, Garrett falling into step behind her. The rusty iron key was still in her pocket, a heavy, permanent reminder of where she came from and exactly what she was capable of. Did Hannah's ruthless revenge give you chills? She proved that sometimes the most valuable inheritance isn't money. It's the power to expose the truth and rewrite your own destiny. If you loved this twist-filled story of betrayal and justice, hit that like button, share it with your friends to see what they would do, and subscribe to our channel for more jaw-dropping, real-life inspired drama. See you next time.